The city hummed like an engine that never cooled. Even in the early hours before dawn, when most windows went dark, a low current of sound remained. Cars sighing on wet asphalt, a distant train slipping under the streets, someone's laughter bleeding through a half-open window. It was a living thing, that sound. It kept Amelia awake most nights, sitting by her window with a mug of tea that always went cold before she finished it. She liked the view, not for the skyline or the bridges, but for the tiny human details. A delivery driver smoking beneath a flickering streetlight, a woman in a pink coat walking her dog in the rain, the way the city's rhythm kept moving no matter how still her own life felt. She had been a therapist for 7 years, and sometimes it felt less like helping and more like absorbing static from everyone else's lives. People came to her with the weight of things they couldn't say anywhere else, and when they left, the words stayed behind, filling the air of her office like dust she could never quite sweep away. On Monday, the rain started before sunrise. By the time she reached her building, her coat clung to her shoulders and her hair had begun to curl in thin, dark strands. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and eucalyptus oil. She turned the key, stepped inside, and let the door close behind her. The silence pressed against her ears. Then, gradually, she heard the ticking of the small silver clock on her desk. Her first client of the day was Daniel Cho, a teacher from the East Side who had come to her 3 weeks ago, saying he couldn't sleep anymore. He arrived early, as always, his posture careful, his face pale from a life spent under fluorescent lights. He sat down without a word, his eyes following the rain that crawled across the window behind her. "I saw him change the grades again," he said finally. His voice was rough, like he hadn't used it all weekend. "He's still doing it, and the administration hasn't said a word." Amelia waited, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "I did the right thing," he said. I told them everything. But now they look at me like I'm the one who's broken something. The teachers, the students. I can feel it when I walk down the hall. The quiet. "What do you feel when that happens?" she asked softly. He smiled without humor, like I'm standing in a room full of people who can't hear me screaming. The rain deepened, tapping against the window. She wanted to tell him that loneliness after doing the right thing was still better than comfort built on silence. But she didn't. Instead, she let the quiet stretch between them until his breathing slowed. When he left, he thanked her in the polite, mechanical way that people thank baristas and taxi drivers. She watched him step into the rain, his shoulders already bowing forward. She sat for a long time afterward, staring at the door he had closed. There was something in the way he said it, "He's still doing it," that made her uneasy, not about the cheating itself, but about the strange mixture of moral clarity and desperation in his tone. Later that afternoon, between clients, she walked to the corner cafe to clear her head. The place was small, full of mismatched chairs and the smell of espresso and wet coats. She ordered a black coffee and sat near the window, watching people hurry by with umbrellas. A man at the next table was talking too loudly on the phone, arguing about a contract. 2 teenagers were laughing over something on a cracked phone screen. The noise felt oddly comforting. "Dr. Ward?" a voice said beside her. She looked up. Daniel was standing there, rain still dripping from his jacket. His expression was uncertain, apologetic. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said quickly. It's funny, seeing you outside the office. I almost didn't recognize you." She smiled faintly. "You can call me Amelia, and it's all right. I'm just taking a break." He hesitated, then asked if he could sit. She nodded. He looked different here, less guarded, almost boyish in the way his fingers fidgeted with the edge of his cup. "I keep thinking about what you said last week, about how truth can isolate us. I think that's what's happening. I'm telling the truth, and it's pushing everyone away." She studied him for a moment. Sometimes the truth doesn't set us free. Sometimes it just changes the kind of prison we live in. He looked at her, startled, and then gave a small, tired laugh. "That's dark." "It's realistic," she said, "but it doesn't mean there's no way out." They talked for 20 minutes about small things, weather, books, the absurdity of teenage drama. When he finally stood to leave, he seemed lighter, as if simply being seen outside the sterile walls of her office had reminded him that life existed beyond his moral purgatory. That night, Amelia sat again by her window. The rain had stopped, and the city glowed, wet asphalt reflecting red and yellow light. She thought about Daniel, about how a single ethical act could unravel a person's sense of belonging. She wondered if courage was really just a quieter form of self-destruction. When her phone buzzed, she ignored it first. Then she saw the name, Eleanor, her sister. She hesitated, then answered. "Hey," Eleanor said. "You sound tired." "I am," Amelia admitted. "How's Mom?" "She's fine. She keeps asking if you're coming for her birthday." I told her not to get her hopes up. Amelia rubbed her forehead. "It's just hard to take time off right now." "It's always hard," Eleanor said, her voice sharp but not unkind. "You spend your life listening to other people's problems, but you never listen when someone wants you there." The silence that followed was heavy. Finally, Amelia said, "I'll try." "Try harder," Eleanor replied, then softened. "I just miss you, that's all." After the call, Amelia sat staring at the city until the lights blurred. She realized she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed without calculating what it meant. The next week passed in fragments. Daniel continued his sessions, each one a little more strained. He spoke about feeling watched, about his colleagues whispering. "I think someone went through my desk," he said once. "I can tell when something's been moved." Amelia made notes, cautious. She'd seen paranoia creep in through the cracks of stress before, but this felt different, more like a moral infection spreading outward from a single wound. One evening, as she was locking up, she saw him across the street. He wasn't coming to see her. He was just standing there, watching the building. When she met his eyes, he raised a hand in acknowledgement, awkward and fleeting, then walked away. That night, she dreamed of hallways that led nowhere. She woke with her pulse hammering and couldn't remember why she was afraid. The following Thursday, Daniel missed his appointment. No call, no message. She tried not to worry, but the unease stayed with her like a shadow. 2 days later, she saw his name on the news. High school teacher found dead in apparent suicide. Her breath caught halfway in her throat. The article was brief. Police were investigating, no foul play suspected. He had left a note, but they didn't publish its contents. She turned off the screen and sat perfectly still. The sound of the city came back to her. Car horns, laughter, the distant wail of a siren. But everything felt muffled, unreal. She went to the window and pressed her hand to the glass. The lights blurred again, but this time it wasn't the rain. For the first time in years, she cried without restraint. Not for Daniel exactly, but for the smallness of it. How a man could disappear in a city full of eyes and no one would really see. She took the next morning off, walking aimlessly through the streets. Every face seemed both familiar and foreign. In a bookstore, she picked up a novel Daniel had mentioned in their sessions, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. She bought it, though she doubted she'd ever read it. When she returned home, a letter was waiting in her mailbox. No return address. The handwriting was sharp, deliberate. Her stomach tightened as she recognized the name inside. "Dr. Ward, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep going. I just wanted someone to know that I wasn't wrong. I saw what I saw. I told the truth. And still, I was made the villain. Maybe courage isn't rewarded in this world, but at least you believed me. Thank you for listening." There was no signature, just a single smudge where his pen had pressed too hard. She sat on the floor, reading it again and again until the words blurred. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her desk drawer. In the days that followed, she returned to work, though something inside her felt quieter, thinner. She found herself speaking less during sessions, listening more to the pauses between words. People came and went, a woman hiding bruises beneath long sleeves, a young man afraid of becoming his father, a nurse who couldn't stop dreaming of sirens. Each of them carried their own small weights. But Daniel's story stayed with her. One night, weeks later, she received another letter, this time from the school where he had worked. They were holding a memorial service. They wanted her to attend, since she had been his therapist. She almost declined, but something in her, guilt, maybe made her go. The gymnasium smelled of polished wood and faint disinfectant. Dozens of chairs faced a small stage where a framed photo of Daniel rested beside a flickering candle. His colleagues spoke in careful, hollow sentences about dedication, about compassion, about the tragedy of loss. No one mentioned what had driven him to it. Afterward, a woman approached her. She was in her 40s, with tired eyes and a badge that read Principal Bennett. "You must be Dr. Ward," she said. "He mentioned you once. Said you were helping him." "I tried," Amelia said quietly. The principal nodded. "We all did, I suppose." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "You know, the investigation he started, it uncovered more than anyone expected. The teacher he reported had been altering transcripts for years. We found everything. He was right all along." Amelia's throat tightened. "Did you tell the staff?" "Of course. But people like simple stories. They'd already decided who to blame." When Amelia left the building, the air was heavy with the smell of rain again. She stood on the steps, watching the clouds roll over the skyline. Somewhere deep inside her, something shifted. Not relief, not closure, just a faint recognition of how truth and loneliness were sometimes the same things spoken in different tongues. That night, she began to write. Not a report or a journal, but letters. Unsent, quiet letters to no one in particular. She wrote about Daniel, about courage, about how small acts could carry the weight of entire lives. She didn't know why she wrote them, only that she needed to. The words became her way of remembering that empathy, no matter how painful, was the only thing keeping her human. She kept writing those unsent letters until they felt less like confession and more like work, like a map she was drawing for herself. They helped her name things that otherwise slid away. The exact timbre of Daniel's last laugh. The way his fingers had trembled when he talked about the students. The small, stubborn dignity he'd clung to even as the world around him chose easier stories. Winter edged toward spring. The city thinned and swelled with moods. Icy mornings that burned into bright afternoons. A stuttering thaw that made rivers of the gutters. Amelia's caseload shifted. New names arrived in her calendar each week. Some came like flares, urgent, loud. Others like small, persistent threads, people who returned until she felt they were part of the furniture. She met a woman who spoke in metaphors and a man who cataloged his dreams. She met a mother who couldn't forgive herself for a single mistake and a man who used his hands to keep his hands from hurting others. One afternoon, a new intake form arrived with the name Jonah Mercer scrawled in a cramped, deliberate hand. The clerk mentioned him as she handed over the file. Homeless, but clean, asked for sliding scale if you can take it, she said, flipping through the pages of her computer. Says he needs help with trust issues. Also, he asked to be scheduled at 3. Said mornings are rough for him. Amelia filed the form, then looked at the clock. 3 worked. Maybe that was why she kept her hours the way she did. Because the city asked for hands at odd times, and people came with their particular insomnia. He arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a worn coat that had seen better years and a pair of boots that had been polished one time too many. He carried himself as if his body had learned to guard quietness. There was a small scar along his cheek, pale like an old line of ice. When he sat, he looked like he might fall into the chair and then hold himself there with effort. "You asked for a sliding scale," she said, offering the familiar chair and the more familiar silence. He blinked. "I asked for time," he said. His voice was gravel and weather. "Time to tell it right." "Then tell me," she said. He exhaled once, as if letting air carry a weight. "I used to be someone who fixed things. Cars mostly. I liked oil and the language of engines. It was direct, turn this, tighten that. It either worked or it didn't. Then, his jaw tightened. Then there were things I couldn't fix. The ones I love, they started breaking in ways tools couldn't reach." He told her about a woman, Sarah, short, intense, with hair like a page torn from a book. They'd lived together in a small apartment, argued over small things until arguments became a reservoir of quiet resentments. One night she left and the apartment stayed cold. He had tried to find her, leaving notes, calling, asking friends. Weeks passed. He found her eventually in a shelter downtown. She'd been frightened by something she wouldn't or couldn't name. They tried again. It didn't last. The fracture widened. When she finally left for good, she took a small bag and an old cat and a piece of him that he'd measured in the space her absence made. He laughed, a sound like a chain being dragged. You'd think I'd have learned that not everything can be fixed, but I believed I could fix the things that mattered. So when the bills came and the trust frayed, I started doing things I'm not proud of. I pawned tools. I took a job doing deliveries, easy money, if you don't mind a few things being borrowed along the way. He met her eyes then, steady as a bearing. I was arrested once. Not pretty. They gave me community service, said I was lucky. Lucky, as if being poor is a quota you can check off. Amelia felt the precision in his language. Lucky. She'd heard that irony before. The world that calls people lucky for surviving its indifference. She didn't judge. She listened. What do you want from therapy? She asked, because questions clear and shaped were how she worked. To stop thinking I have to fix everything, he said. To stop thinking that if I don't, I'll lose the only things that make me feel like me. To learn to trust without a receipt. He said that last phrase, trust without a receipt, and it lodged in her. They spoke, slowly, the session stretching beyond the scheduled hour. He left with a sense of something like relief, and she watched him go into the street with a small pile of folded hope. He seemed to shrink and then reassert his shape like someone who had found a way to fold himself to fit the space he had. Amelia began to see patterns in the people who came through her door, small redundancies of shame, threads that rewound into each other. Daniel's ghost lingered. She felt it in Jonah's voice, in the way clients measured their mistakes, in a way they asked for help while protecting the exact shape of their guilt. She found herself thinking about the variegated anatomy of kindness, how an act could be small and still seismic. Outside of the office, her life carried on in the carved routines of someone who had learned to compartmentalize. She met her sister for coffee, where they talked, unproductively, about their mother's birthday. She called her mother, who asked kindly if Amelia was eating enough, as if nourishment might be the hinge that would fix decades of carefully arranged fractures. She read the unsent letters she'd written and then crumpled them, thinking better of sending anything. On a rainy Tuesday, as she crossed the street near her apartment, she saw a man drop his wallet. A young woman in a fluorescent jacket bent to pick it up, hesitated, and then slid it into her own bag before she walked away. The man scrambled, surprised, calling after her. Amelia stood at the corner and watched the scene. For a moment, she felt the city tighten around its throat, someone else's small theft folding into someone's larger loss. She crossed the street impulsively, the way people do when a single thing absorbs their attention. The man whose wallet had been taken stood with his hands in his pockets, embarrassed and angry. "Excuse me," she said, not sure what she was doing. "Did you lose?" She described the wallet. He looked at her gratefully and then despondent. "Yeah, it's all I had left. Bus pass, a few bucks my phone slipped too." He glanced down the block where the woman in the fluorescent jacket had vanished into a doorway. "I don't have much. I'm heading to a shelter. If I don't get there, I don't." She felt a tug, an impulse to replace, to fix, to fold herself into the place where the world seemed kinder. She handed him some bills from her coat without thinking. He blinked, startled, then accepted them with a nod that carried an apology for having to be allowed to accept help. "How are you getting to the shelter?" she asked, because she wanted to keep the conversation, wanted to anchor the moment. "Walking," he said. "It's not far." But he stopped, as if unsure whether to say something more. "Come with me," she said, before she could stop herself. "There's a coffee shop around the corner. We can sit. You can charge your phone. I'll call the shelter for you. I have some time." The words felt like a rope thrown across a current. He hesitated, like someone deciding whether to trust a stranger. Then, because the world is often smaller than our fears, he nodded. They sat in a small cafe that smelled like cinnamon and burnt sugar. He introduced himself as Mateo, young, soft-featured, with a voice that steadied as his agitation cooled. He spoke of a job that had fallen through, of rent he couldn't pay after a hospital stay, of an eviction notice he'd ignored too long. She listened. He thanked her, repeatedly, words that folded into gratitude and a crumpling embarrassment. When they left, the rain had stopped. The city looked like a video paused on stillness, the puddles catching the neon and the sky breathless. Mateo shook Amelia's hand with an earnestness that made her smile. He promised to keep in touch, to check in if he could, to let her know if they'd helped him find a bed that night. It felt small and also huge. A person who would have been passed by had been given a moment that made the difference between a night sleeping under a bus shelter and a hot, cracked seat where safety for a few hours might exist. She thought about that as she walked home, about how an ordinary day could be interrupted by the need to choose kindness. That night, she wrote again. Only this time, not to Daniel or to herself, but a fictional piece, a short scene of two strangers, one small act, a pocket change passed across a damp table, a life nudged back on axis. Writing it felt less like therapy and more like practice, like practicing for the real thing until your hands remembered what to do. The kindness she'd given Mateo didn't erase the complexity of the city. 2 days later, she passed the same corner and saw the fluorescent jacket woman again. This time she watched her from a distance and noticed the way the woman's bag bulged, the way her shoulders were hunched as if folding into a permanent interior. For a ridiculous second, Amelia wanted to confront her, to accuse her of selfishness, to demand restitution. Instead, she watched as the woman disappeared between buildings, like a figure swallowed by the city. At work, Jonah returned for a second session, and she listened as he spoke about trusting a woman who had let him down, about the hours spent trying to fix what was not meant to be fixed. There was a tenderness in his language when he described Sarah, like someone tracing the seam of a faded garment. He admitted, with the courage of someone who'd finally practiced speech, that trust had become a ledger for him, a list of credits and debits. He didn't know how to be present without tallying. You could start by letting go of the ledger, Amelia said. Trust is not a contract. It's a practice. It's learning to show up, even when you're not guaranteed repayment. He looked at her, worn and grateful. Show up for what? For more pain, he asked. Sometimes you show up for the small things, she said. A phone charged, a cup of coffee, a ride to the shelter. It's not about grand gestures. It's about the accumulation of moments that say, you exist and you're not invisible. He nodded, as if receiving a small, valuable tool. She thought of the wallet, of Mateo's gratitude, of Daniel's letters, and the fragile lines that connected them all. Actions that might be tiny in isolation, but when collected, created something like a life raft. Spring warmed into the city and then slammed back into a last cold gust of winter. Cases in her practice changed in scale. Some were small enough to feel like adjustments, some were catastrophic enough to land like blows. She began seeing a pattern of loneliness and bravado. People who presented a brittle strength to the world while harboring a private ruin. She started dreaming in fragments. A hallway that led to water, a toothless smile in a crowded station, a single lamp that refused to go out. Months passed. Jonah's progress was slow but real. Mateo's shelter call returned with a number she'd saved, and she coached him through the process of getting accepted for a bed. He called once to let her know he'd made it, his voice transparent with relief. Amelia felt that relief as if it were her own. And yet, even as she helped others, there came nights when she sat by her window and felt the weight of small things pressing in. Daniel's notes shoved in her drawer, letters she never sent, the knowledge that kindness wasn't a cure and might not always be returned. She thought about the woman with the fluorescent jacket, about the man who dropped his wallet, about Jonah and Mateo, and the community that folded around them. She realized, with a kind of resigned clarity, that the city was a series of intersecting debts, some reciprocal, some not, and that living meant making choices about which ones to pay. One evening, just as the city was settling into the late blue of twilight, Amelia received an email from an address she didn't recognize. The subject line was short, For you. The message contained a single paragraph, typed in blocky text. You found me small kindness. You listened when Daniel couldn't. I don't know how to say thank you. If you ever see a wallet on the corner by the bakery, know it was mine. I kept your face in my head like a promise. There was no name, only a photo attached. A coffee-stained cup under a lamplight, the city blurred beyond it. For a long time, she sat with the message open, the words glimmering on the screen like something alive. She printed it and slipped the paper into the notebook where she kept the unsent letters. The city didn't need heroes. It needed hands that would reach without counting. It needed people who could accept that their actions might not make the whole world change, but perhaps the trajectory of one life. She folded that thought into her palm like a small, living thing and then went to bed. Outside, someone on the street laughed, sharp and brief, and then the city breathed in and out, and life continued. The email stayed on her mind longer than it should have. She read it again that night, the words like an ember warm under her palm. You found me small kindness. You listened when Daniel couldn't. Whoever had written it had seen something in her that she herself sometimes doubted. That listening could be more than a job, could be an act that threaded people together in ways they didn't expect. Spring leaned towards summer. The light changed. Longer evenings, the city's corners waking to a different kind of noise. Bicycles, laughter spilling from stoops, a restaurant patio where someone was learning to play a trumpet. Amelia found herself going to bed later because the world seemed suddenly too loud to sleep through and too alive to ignore. She kept writing in the notebooks, not the dry, clinical notes she logged for clients, but the other kind, fragmentary, elegiac, sentences that try to hold the shape of small mercies. Then one Tuesday morning, a thick envelope slid under her office door before she unlocked it. Someone had come early. The envelope had no return address. She opened it at her desk between a session for a nurse with recurring nightmares and a young man who could not stop replaying his father's temper. Inside was a subpoena, formal, stamped, the paper cold with bureaucracy. The city's court seal stared up at her like an accusation. She carried the paper into the hallway and read it again. Production of records, the estate of Daniel Cho. The wording was official, the request precise. A reporter's name was typed at the bottom. An urgency she could feel through the paper. They wanted her notes. Her hands trembled for the first time that morning. For a therapist, confidentiality was not a punctuation mark. It was the architecture of work. Clients told her things under promise. The sanctity of the room was everything. To hand over records would be to betray that architecture, to rearrange lives on paper so other people could judge them with headlines. She paged through Daniel's file. The clinical notes folded into the folder like a map of a slow unraveling. Intake forms, the cadence of his sessions, phone messages she had returned, and one she had not. The file was intimate in a way no other paper in her office was. His handwriting, the dates, the small attempt to be rational in the margins, they meant more than evidence. They were relics of a life she had tried to steady. She thought of his unsigned letter and the way he'd thanked her in that bare, impossible way. She thought of the principal at the memorial, who had told her the investigation had borne truth, and of the parents' whispers. There was a public appetite now for tidy narratives, corruption exposed, wrongdoing punished, a neat moral curve. But that appetite devoured nuance. It turned grief into spectacle. She called the clinic's legal consultant. You can't produce therapy notes without a court order that overrules privilege, the consultant said. His language was legalist, a series of safe hedges. But subpoenas happen. You must respond. You must maintain client confidentiality unless explicitly ordered otherwise. So there's a way to refuse? Amelia asked, the way someone asks whether a house with a broken railing is still safe to climb. There's always a way to argue, he said, but be prepared. The press will not like the answer no. The reporter's name on the subpoena belonged to a local outlet that thrived on moral storms. Their headlines were quick and their memory short. Amelia felt the equation compressing. The city wanted to know who Daniel was beyond his own voice, and they had a right to ask. But she also had another obligation, a person's inner life, entrusted to her, protected by a promise she would not break lightly. She scheduled a call with the estate's lawyer, then sat with the decision in the hollow between clients. Confidentiality had always been her holy thing. Now it felt like a test. She found herself thinking, not for the first time, that being ethical sometimes meant choosing a quiet loneliness over public applause. That afternoon, Jonah arrived with a bruise blooming at his temple. He'd been mugged, small things, he said. He'd gone to a back alley for a cigarette during a shift, and someone had tried to take the deliveries from his van. He shrugged it off, asked about grounding techniques, and then told her, almost as an afterthought, that he'd been offered stable work by a man who ran a mechanic shop on 3rd. He says, if I keep my head down and don't ask questions, there's more for me than pawn tools, Jonas said, watching his fingers curl. You told me you wanted to stop borrowing the world's possessions to stitch your life together, Amelia said. Is this different? Jonah's laugh was small and brittle. It's always different till it isn't. He stared at the window. Outside, a child chased a pigeon's wake in a patch of sun. She asked more, her voice the same one she used with other clients, and Jonah answered with the careful honesty of someone mapping a risk. I'll do what I need to do so I don't end up in shelters again, he said. I'll be careful. Careful how? She prompted. Careful by not asking for more than I can pay for. He looked up with something like hope. I know it sounds like I'm making excuses, but it doesn't sound like excuses, she said. It sounds like a ledger you're trying to close. Just don't make a ledger for yourself that you have to pay off with your life. Jonah agreed, and then they sat with breathing exercises until the city's noise seemed to recede. When he left for the shop on 3rd, Amelia watched him go and felt the weight of her own powerlessness. She could offer a map, tools, how to calm a body, how to name a feeling, but she could not make the city change the terms it offered people, survival or pride, quick money or the slow ache of integrity. That night, she told Eleanor about the subpoena. Her sister's reaction was immediate, sharp-edged. You refuse, Amelia, Eleanor said. They can't have that. They can't turn someone's grief into clickbait. What if the court orders me? Amelia asked. She knew the legal battle could be fought, but she also knew how often the law favored expedience over ethics. Then you fight, Eleanor said. You don't give them permission to disembowel someone's life. Eleanor's fervor comforted and frightened her. Their mother had always been decisive in a way Amelia envied. Eleanor had the careful moral certainty of someone who'd chosen a life visible and loud, where decisions had immediate consequence. Amelia wanted that sometimes, an ability to step forward without asking every ethical angle for permission. The next morning, a reporter called her office. He was polite, theatrical even, with the practiced cadence of someone who wanted a confession but needed it disguised as a conversation. Dr. Ward, he said, I'm writing a piece about the late Mr. Daniel Cho. People have questions, and your records might answer them. I can't comment on my clients, she said, the practiced, professional phrase she had used 1,000 times. We're not asking for specifics, just context. Was he suffering? Did he feel isolated? This could help readers understand him, to humanize him. She hesitated. He was human, she said finally. He was a person who made choices that mattered to him. The reporter prodded, and she found herself speaking in the gray calculus she'd been trying to avoid. I'm not at liberty to discuss internal therapeutic material. If the estate wants records, they know the legal process. The call ended with the reporter's sigh, a theatrical concession. She felt exposed afterward, like someone who had stood too close to a bright light and could not immediately correct for the glare. Over the next week, the legal requests multiplied. The estate's attorney asked questions. The paper's editor sent a polite but insistent email. Her inbox, which ordinarily contained appointment confirmations and community center flyers, now held subpoenas and firm requests. The file drawer that held Daniel's notes felt heavier. She consulted the clinic's ethics board. If you must produce records, the senior clinician said, redact identifying information and annotate for clinical relevance. But be prepared for pushback. This is not simply a matter of privacy. It's about how the public narrates grief. How will it be narrated? Amelia asked. In short headlines, the clinicians said, it will be framed in a way that sells. You should consider the harm to surviving family members, to potential survivors. That phrasing, potential survivors, stung. The public's right to know was not in dispute. The conflict was ethical, a collision of obligations. She realized then that the role of a therapist in public tragedies was something she had never been trained to handle in her internships or seminars. Ethics class had spoken of boundaries in theory. It had not prepared her for the sudden glare of the courthouse and the newsroom at once. The small kindness she'd given Mateo came back to mind. How the man had carried a relief so thin it might have been paper. She thought about all the small choices she'd made. A call to a shelter, a loan of cash, an hour of attention. They had ripple effects, sometimes gentle, sometimes unpredictable. The subpoena felt like an attempt to measure ripples with a ruler that couldn't bend. One evening, a young woman arrived at the clinic, breathless, hair damp from rain. She waited for the receptionist to look up, then approached Amelia directly. "Dr. Ward?" she said, voice urgent. Amelia recognized her from the memorial at the school, a student who had been in Daniel's class. She sat across from Amelia, hands trembling. "You knew him," she said, then added, as if any of this were a diagnosis. "I think you should know he was thinking about suing the district. He said he felt watched, like there was corruption." Her voice broke. "I feel guilty. I think I could have done something." Amelia listened. The girl's story threaded into the larger knot. There were other voices now, students and parents, each ripple pressing outward. The city was assembling its story, and the story risked being loud rather than true. Amelia made a choice that night. She called the estate's lawyer and asked for time. Time to consult, to protect the integrity of her client files, to respond with both legal care and ethical clarity. She refused to be the single point where a private life became public spectacle. She drafted a response that obeyed the law's letter but refused to hand over the spirit of her notes. When a reporter's outlet published a scathing editorial calling therapists gatekeepers of grief, Amelia felt the scalpel of public opinion press against her dignity. Colleagues sent sympathetic emails. One clinician called to offer to testify. The ethics committee convened after hours in her office and argued like siblings over what it meant to be faithful to confidentiality when so many hands reached for stories. In the middle of that tumult, Jonah's work at the mechanic shop turned out to be what he'd promised and what he feared. The owner, a broad-shouldered man named Victor, treated Jonah with a stable kind of respect that made Jonah's shoulders relax the way a broken hinge might when oiled. Jonah called to tell her he'd been paid early, that he'd given the first real, honest sum to an uncle he'd disappointed. He cried, Jonah said, voice thick, said he knew I was trying. It felt different. Amelia felt both happy and stunned. The small acts of the city, another person offering a fair wage, a boss who listened, could alter trajectories. She wrote it down in her notebook, as if cataloging proof that the world sometimes offered a ledger of kindness that was not empty. But the subpoena lingered like a shadow. A judge signaled a hearing date. The city's paper printed op-eds. An anonymous commenter accused her of covering for liars. Amelia sat in her office and imagined Daniel asking, with the naive sadness of the living, whether she had done enough. She had a trust that following the ethics, the law, and her own moral compass would be enough. She prepared for court with the help of the clinic's counsel, collecting redactions, annotating clinical relevance, preparing to explain the sanctity of the therapeutic space. There would be an argument to be made that the records, taken out of context and placed before a public forum, would not illuminate so much as distort. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled of coffee and paper and a city that loved procedure almost as much as it loved headlines. She wore a dark suit that felt like armor and a small pendant her mother had given her, old silver, its surface worn by touch. She sat in the sterile waiting room, hands folded, watching the slow choreography of people moving through the courthouse. When her turn came, the judge was patient in a way that made Amelia think of therapy sessions that succeeded more by steadiness than by revelation. The estate's counsel argued for transparency. The reporter's attorney painted a picture of a city that owed its grief a public truth. Amelia's voice was small but steady as she spoke about the ethical duty therapists hold, the harm that can come from exposing raw, clinical notes to a public hungry for tidy narratives. She explained, as plainly as she could, why context mattered and why a human being's interior life was not to be plucked like fruit for inspection. The judge leaned back, considering. When the decision came, it was not the dramatic victory she'd feared to lose or hoped to win. He ordered limited production, only documents directly relevant to the claim of negligence that might have arisen from the school investigation. Her notes would remain largely protected, redacted heavily, and annotated so that anyone who read them would at least have the scaffolding of clinical interpretation. It was not a triumph. It was a compromise, lawyery and provisional. On her way out of the courthouse, a reporter called from the sidewalk. Microphone extended like a small accusation. "Dr. Ward, did you withhold the truth?" he asked. She thought of Daniel and the letter he had left, of Jonah counting his days in honest labor, of Mateo calling from the shelter to say he'd slept in a bed. She thought of the small acts of care that never made the front page. "I protected what I was legally and ethically bound to protect," she said. "That does not mean I'm hiding anything. It means I'm choosing how to tell someone's story." The camera clicked. The reporter looked unsatisfied, but Amelia felt a kind of relief settle like rainfall after a long drought, enough to wash the worst of the dust from her shoulders. The city kept moving. People kept needing her. She went home to her window and wrote another unsent letter. Short this time, a line about making choices in the glare and choosing the shadow when it is the only place where someone can be safe. The note slid into the drawer with the others, the small reliquary of her moral life. She slept that night with the pendant warm against her chest, and when she woke the next morning, the sun cut across the floorboards in a line so bright it made the dust motes dance like confetti. Outside, someone laughed, the same sharp, fleeting sound that had been a refrain through the months, and the city breathed, indifferent, relentless, waiting for anyone to pick up the phone and whisper that they were not alone. She woke that morning with the taste of metal on her tongue, as if the court's decision had left a residue she couldn't scrub away. The compromise felt practical, necessary, but it had also opened a seam in her life where the city's appetite could prod and pry. She found herself watching shadows differently now, pausing before putting a hand on a doorknob, listening for the small, human sounds that might mean a life was tipping. Jonah's steady rhythm at Victor's shop became a small proof to her that people could reroute a life if given a steady enough beam to walk on. He sent an honest text. "Got my first paycheck, bought dinner for my uncle," and she read it 3 times, grateful as if the message were a small, rare fruit. Mateo called sometimes now, his voice a little more whole, the shelter's director having helped him link to a day job at a bakery. These were small, practical victories, the sorts of things that rarely made the news, but which, in her ledger, counted for something close to salvation. Still, the city had other business. It rearranged people with the indifferent precision of weather. New faces came into her office. An older woman whose son had gone missing in a war overseas and now lived in a temporary room 3 neighborhoods away. A young man who believed he was being watched by cameras hidden in the lamps of his apartment. A woman whose hands trembled when she touched her husband's shirts because the fabric smelled like the man he used to be. Before the drinking, before the silence. Each of them draped some weight across her desk and left it there. She gathered them, cataloged them, tried to make sense of the patterns. Then, as though the city were testing her again, a call came that unmoored the day. It was Lena Park, a name she had seen on an intake form weeks earlier and then forgotten in the pile of new clients. Lena had not scheduled. She had called, her voice urgent, raw. "I need to see you," Lena said. "Today. Please." "You're not on the schedule," Amelia said, though her voice softened. She glanced at the calendar. There was a thin slice of empty time after lunch. "I don't have time," Lena said, the words sharp. Tomorrow isn't an option. When Lena appeared, she carried with her the nervous energy of someone whose life had tilted toward a moral precipice. She was 24, a researcher by training, a volunteer for a civic transparency project that had been sifting through procurement contracts. Her hair was short at one side, long at the other, as if she could not decide which face to show the world. "I found something," she said without preamble. "Something big. Payments. Shell companies. A pattern. It looks like a kickback scheme tied to the district's vendors. If this goes public, people will be exposed, officials, contractors. It could change everything. It could also ruin people who aren't responsible. I don't know what to do." Amelia listened the way she always listened at first, without framing, without bias, letting details settle into a quiet shape. Lena's hands shook a little as she pushed a folder across the small table. Inside were spreadsheets, emails, red flags circled in bright ink. "Why did you come to me?" Amelia asked. "Because I don't know how to carry it," Lena said. "And because someone told me once that therapists help people think through the moral part of things, not just the facts. I need help not to ruin lives out of righteous anger." The irony of the request, the combination of data and plea, pressed at Amelia. This was not a case of grief or addiction. It was a map of potential public harm, an ethical dilemma of a civic magnitude. Yet it fit into the same muscle group she had spent years exercising, weighing risk, gauging harm, deciding whether intervention would save or shatter. "Who else knows?" Amelia asked. "Just me and the nonprofit's director. We were going to triangulate, verify, then go public. But some of the vendors threatened me. One of them left a message, thinly veiled. It felt like a warning. I don't want to be the person who goes down because she wanted to be right." Amelia thought of Daniel, of how truth had carved him out of the world that had been his. She thought of the court's compromise and how the glare of public scrutiny had a way of burning nuance into cinders. Yet she also knew that secrets allowed wrongdoing to breed. "What do you want from this?" she asked to stop it. "To expose it? To protect people?" It sounded clumsy out loud, but Lena wasn't there for phrases. She was there for moral triangulation, for help deciding what a person owes to others when the cost of truth is ruin. Lena looked down at the papers, the numbers like an argument. "I want to do the right thing," she said, "but I'm terrified of exposure, of hurting the innocent, of being the instrument of someone's life collapsing." The question was classical and modern at once. What responsibility does a single person owe to a community when acting might topple a house of cards, but could also flatten innocent people under the rubble? Amelia found herself thinking of a phrase she'd used with Jonah, trust without a receipt, and how it felt here like a fragile, impossible ethic. "You don't have to decide today," she said. "We can map the harms. We can consider alternatives. You can verify, anonymize, or approach a journalist whose ethics you trust. There are ways that protect people." Lena's mouth twisted. And what if there's no such journalist? What if every outlet is hungry for the spectacle? What if the law only offers a stick at the end? Amelia nodded. "Then you design for harm reduction. Say your goal is to minimize collateral damage. Identify implicated individuals, but separate patterns of institutional wrongdoing from the single-person narratives that could destroy lives." They spoke for an hour, then two. Lena's breath steadied as the plan took shape. Slow verification, a step toward a trustworthy reporter, consultation with legal counsel, and a deliberate effort to shield those who were tangentially connected from being dragged into the mire. It was hardly heroic. It was the old work of compromise and moral triage. By the end of the session, Lena smiled faintly, less the smile of triumph, and more the starved, wary grin of someone who'd been given a map out of the woods. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know if I'll do it, but at least I know how not to do it badly." After Lena left, Amelia sat alone in the dim office, the city breathing its own secretive rhythm outside the window. She made a note to contact the nonprofit's director, to offer to sit through interviews if Lena needed support. But she also felt the weight of the choice the young woman carried. It wasn't her information. She wasn't the one who had to decide whether the city's truth needed to be extracted like a stinging tooth. But she could offer a calm channel through which that decision could pass. A week later, Jonah's path diverged into a thorn choice of his own. Victor, who had been kind and reliable, offered him extra work, overtime, and a cut on unofficial jobs, ones that were technically repossessions but often blurred into gray areas. "Help me with a pickup," Victor said one evening, leaning against the shop's counter. "I need someone who knows how to do it clean." Jonah's face tightened. The offer was quick money and the kind that would let him send a larger sum home. It smelled like the same ledger, debts, credits. He called Amelia that night, voice low. "They want me to help with it," he said. "I know it's wrong, but they're desperate. I can help my uncle with rent. I can get back on track." "What's the work?" Amelia asked, careful not to moralize. "Pick up stuff," he said. "People behind on payments. Bariclas. Sometimes you get a call that the owner's in arrears and the bank wants it. Other times, it's someone who's fallen on hard times. I don't want to be the jackal." "You don't have to decide alone," she said. "But ask yourself, will this keep you safe or put you in a place where you have to choose again? Is there another way to make the money, legitimate, slower, but clean?" He paused. "There's a job with a delivery union. Long hours, legit, but it's months away. I can't wait that long." "You'll have to weigh the harm," Amelia said. "Will helping with the pickup cause more harm than the good the money brings?" Jonah pressed his thumb to his forehead. The arithmetic of survival is a moral calculus the privileged seldom have to mind. Amelia thought, you can teach someone to hold an ethic, but the world still asks whether the hunger is a permission slip. "Think about what you can live with," she said finally. "Not what looks best on paper, but what keeps you from becoming someone you'll regret being." He didn't answer immediately. Later, he texted, "I said no." She exhaled like someone who had just stepped back from an edge with another person's hand in their own. The relief was sharp and small. Jonah went on to keep the steady hours and to accept the slow pay. His sense of dignity returned by degrees. The city kept giving and taking. Mateo called, excited this time. "I got the bakery job permanent. They like me." Amelia sat at her kitchen table, smiling with a kind of private joy she couldn't always explain. The small victories stacked up, like tiny stones that might one day become a path. But not all choices led to steady ground. Lena's case moved forward with cautious verification. She had friends in legal clinics and a journalist who agreed to listen under the condition of careful, anonymized vetting. They uncovered a network of shady contracts that implicated a mid-level official, the kind of person who could make vendors' lives easy if they passed envelopes at the right moment. The journalist promised to query the subject for comment and to hold publication until they'd given those named a chance to answer and to protect innocents caught in the pattern. And yet, even with this prudence, the city refused to yield a simple moral shape. A midwife vendor, who'd been implicated by association only because his company had a shared vendor number, was threatened with loss of his small clinic's license. He called Lena in a panic, voicemail shaking with fear. "They told me I'd be shut down," he said. "My patients, they're poor, they don't have anywhere else." Lena's voice trembled as she played the message for Amelia. "You did the right thing," Amelia said, though her voice sounded thin even to her. "But right sometimes slices through the fabric of lives in ways we can't predict. That's why we designed for harm reduction, so we could act with care." Lena closed her eyes and let a soft sound escape. The burden of consequence floated like a storm cloud over them all. Amelia felt it too, the constant misgiving that accompanies ethics. The more you aim for justice, the more you risk being the instrument of someone's ruin. It was a hard, complex grief that didn't resolve into a single sentence. Then, late one night, a man she had never met sat before her in a small storefront clinic where she volunteered once a week. His clothes were neat but frayed at the cuffs, his hands marked with the calluses of labor. He introduced himself as Thomas Reed, and his voice carried the measured melancholy of someone who had lost and kept things in equal measure. "I was part of the procurement council for years," he said. "I saw the way bids were steered. I kept quiet because I had a mortgage, kids, I thought if I kept my head down, I could protect my family. I didn't know how deep it would go. He looked at Lena, then at Amelia. I left those meetings an hour before the vote that awarded the contract in question. I voted for the second best option because I couldn't stomach the obvious corruption. But I didn't blow the whistle. I didn't go to the ethics board. I kept living. The confession sat between them like a heavy tray. Thomas's admission complicated Lena's spreadsheet with the kind of human ambiguity that made headlines sizzle and then rapidly go cold. He wasn't a caricature of evil. He was a man who had made choices within a system that was itself compromised. "What do you want now?" Amelia asked. "To admit it," he said. "To say I should have, and to explain why I didn't. I don't want to be applauded. I want to put on the record so it's not a pure artifact of accusation. I want to apologize." His apology felt measured and honest. Lena stared at him, the numbers and the human faces colliding into something like understanding. Amelia saw a softness in Lena she hadn't seen before, a willingness to separate system culpability from single human failure. They built a path forward, a public statement that would contextualize Thomas's role, an affidavit that his silence had been complicity, but also fear, and a careful rework of the journalist's piece to frame institutional malfeasance rather than individual moral collapse. The journalist agreed. It was not full exoneration of those who had profited, nor was it a blanket absolution for Thomas. It was, rather, a more humane telling, one that insisted the public could hold both complexity and consequence. When the piece ran, it did not explode as Lena feared. The paper ran the story with care, quotes from Thomas, anonymized data, and an editorial that called for Amelia sat at her window that evening, the city laid out like a map of small lights. She thought of Daniel's letters, of Mateo's bed at the shelter, of Jonah's refusal, of Lena's fear and resolve. The moral work felt less like making the world right and more like redirecting the current, sometimes damming, sometimes opening sluices, but always with a careful count of who might drown if waters were shifted too quickly. You give to a man who drops his wallet. Often it looks like nothing at all to anyone but you. She paused, then added a line. "We are not saviors. We are the architects of small repair." Outside, the city leaned into the dark, a murmur of lives breathing and arguing and surviving. In the quiet, she felt less alone than she had after the court hearing. There were fewer certainties than she had liked, but there was also a shape to the work she had chosen. Not the grand, clarifying arc she had once imagined, but an ongoing, attentive tending of human things. She turned the page and began to write again. She woke one morning with the bright, clean ache of someone who had slept poorly, but with purpose. The city outside moved as it always did, buses breathing fog, a dog barking, the far clatter of subway, but something in the light felt different, like a page turned. Over the months, she had been learning not to mistake motion for meaning. The court had settled into memory. Lena's piece had gone out with a caution that smelled of ink and compromise. Jonah had kept the steady job and started taking classes in the evenings. Mateo's voice on the phone was warmer now, the bakery's morning rush having given him a schedule he could count on. Small things stitched together had a tendency to reshape a life. Amelia sat at her kitchen table and spread her unsent letters out like a deck of weathered playing cards. She did not intend to publish them. She was still a therapist, after all, and there were bones of other people in those pages. But the letters had become a kind of private ledger of what she'd witnessed, a map of the small remedies she had carried in her pockets and sometimes given away. She read again the line she had written months ago. "We are not saviors. We are the architects of small repair." The phrase felt truer with every client, with every late-night phone call she had answered, with a crisp legal compromise she had negotiated in the courthouse. She had been thinking for a while about a way to translate the private labor of therapy into something communal without violating trust. The idea came in pieces, like every good moral plan. Start small, ask permission, protect identity, and then build outward. She called the community center and asked for a modest room. the sort of place that smelled faintly of dry markers and instant coffee. She called Jonah and asked him if he would volunteer to show a few young men how to look after a car without feeling like they had to take the world apart to get by. She called Mateo and asked if he might bake enough for a small gathering on a slow morning when the bakery wasn't full. He said yes almost before she finished the sentence. She invited Lena and Thomas to speak about how to handle civic whistleblowing with care. They both agreed, with an awkwardness that felt almost like gratitude. Lena sat at the first meeting, scanning the room like someone making sure the chairs were the right shape for conversation. Thomas arrived clean-shaven and careful, his hands folded as if in apology. Jonah stood in the back with a thermos, his jaw soft where it used to be tense. Amelia began by telling a story she had not told anyone, a composite of all the unsent letters, stripped of clinical detail, remade into a small, anonymous narrative about a teacher in a city that listened too late. She read it aloud slowly, hearing the cadence of sentences she had written for herself, now intended for others. The room was small and warm. Some people frowned, others had their hands over their mouths. At the end, a woman in the second row rose and told them about a neighbor she'd helped after a fire. Another man spoke about the way a stranger once paid for his bus fare when he had nothing left. Slowly, a chain of small deeds began to form in the room. Not moral grandstanding, not virtue signaling, but the plain exchange of human things. People left with crumbs of courage. It was not a triumph. There were awkward moments, an argument about whether to report something to the authorities, a tearful recollection that rippled the group, but the space held. Amelia watched as people learned to triangulate compassion, how to ask what another needs without making a ledger of debt, how to give without expecting a formal receipt in return. She learned new things too, the difference between charity and solidarity, the ways a payment might be kindness or coercion depending on context, how to teach someone to receive as well as to give. The program grew, slowly and quietly. Volunteers from Victor's shop taught basic mechanical maintenance. Mateo began a monthly bread share where people could pick up leftover loaves in exchange for a skill, mending a sweater, helping with the newsletter, teaching a child to read. Lena and Thomas worked with a small legal clinic to create guidelines for whistleblowing that prioritized anonymity and safety. Jonah helped a young man register for a delivery union job, driving him to the interview and then buying him a coffee afterward like somebody old enough to know the value of small celebrations. The city spun on with indifferent precision. There were still court cases, newsletters that favored spectacle, and people who treated kindness like a transaction. But in the small rooms and battered church basements, something else was happening, a quiet architecture of repair. It was not a system, and it was not perfect. Sometimes it was messy. Sometimes it failed spectacularly. But on a Tuesday in late fall, Amelia sat in a circle with people who had once been strangers and felt, in the way your breath catches at a good piece of music, the texture of a community forming. One afternoon, she received an envelope slipped onto the clinic door. No return address. Inside, a small card. Thank you for the coffee. I slept in a bed last night. No name, no detail, just a sentence like a pebble tossed into a pond. She carried that card in her wallet for weeks, a talisman against the ugliness of headlines. She kept to the ethics that had guided her through the subpoena and the hearing. She protected names, anonymized accounts, and insisted that anything discussed in her program was with explicit consent. She had learned, the hard way, how quickly good intentions could become instruments of harm if privacy was discarded for curiosity. But she also learned how much could be done when people agreed to let their small acts be the story. Months later, Jonah brought a boy from his class to the workshop, 15, shyer than the others, who had been sleeping on friends' couches. The boy watched as Jonah and Victor replaced brake pads, his hands hovering over tools until Jonah guided them to work. At the end of the session, the boy opened his phone and called his mother. Amelia watched his profile in the glow of the garage light and felt a small, fierce hope. The boy's voice trembled into the phone, but steadied. He said he would try to get a job and find a place. It was not a promise of transformation, only the brittle, honest step toward one. One winter evening, Lena and Thomas came to the program and announced that the county would implement a new oversight committee, modeled in part on the recommendations they had helped draft. It was not enough. There were still people who slipped through, but it was a start. A councilman stepped down, a vendor was fined. A small clinic got an emergency grant because the midwife's patients had petitioned on his behalf. The ripple effect, fragile and partial, had become visible. Amelia sat in a quiet corner of the community room that night, watching the conversations fold and refold like fabric. She thought of Daniel and the way his letter had been folded into the drawer of her desk, of the heavy paperwork in the courthouse, of the reporter who had once asked whether she had withheld the truth. The memory was a weight, yes, but lighter now because it no longer felt like a single point on which everything balanced. It was a part of the lattice of small choices they made, some visible, some private, but all part of the human work of not letting one another fall entirely. Her sister called more often now. Their conversations were not fully healed, but they were less brittle. Amelia traveled to their mother's small apartment once that winter and stayed for dinner, washing dishes afterward with a kind of presence she rarely had afforded herself. The plates clattered differently under her hands, as if ritual could be a kind of repair too. She found herself laughing more easily at home, a laugh that sounded like a surprise to her own ears. In the quiet stretch of early spring, she finally took out the stack of unsent letters and read them through in order. They were a catalog of things witnessed and small attempts at redress. Some were tender, some angry, some resigned. She blinked at a particular paragraph she had written months ago about the moral cost of solitude, the way loneliness could calcify into a hard bargaining chip, a currency people used against themselves. She had nothing pithy to say about it now, no easy morals to pin on it. Life was not a fable. It was a long, awkward apprenticeship in being other than alone. A young therapist in training had been coming to the program and asked if Amelia would mentor him. He had a tentative empathy, a hunger to learn how to hold a person's life without consuming it. Amelia agreed. She found that teaching someone the craft of listening required naming limitations, refusing heroism, and modeling a stubborn, practical kindness. It was different from the glamorous idea of saving a life. It was the work of helping a person be a person again. The program continued to be modest and stubborn. Little things accrued. A local grocer donated bread on Wednesdays. A retired teacher ran an afternoon reading club. Mateo and the bakery expanded hours to take on a small apprenticeship for those who wanted to learn a trade. People found work, not always the dream of kind, but the kind that held a paycheck and allowed small repairs to be made. Rent paid, classes taken, letters written without the fear of being read for a headline. One evening in late spring, she stood at her window as rain whispered along the glass. The city lights smeared like a watercolor of human motion. She thought of the men and women she'd sat with in rooms that smelled of lavender and coffee. She thought about trust, its fragility and its surprising endurance. She thought about courage, not as spectacle, but as the daily habit of showing up. For court hearings, for a terrified volunteer, for a neighbor with cold feet and a heavy bag. She understood now, with an old person's shockingly simple clarity, that courage and kindness were not always the flashy moves of dramatic books. They were the small, persevering acts that asked very little of the world in return. She felt a small hand on her shoulder. Jonah had stopped by the clinic to borrow a form and had stayed, as he so often did, to drink tea and talk about nothing. He looked at the rain and then at her, and they shared the kind of silence that is not empty. It's companionable, built from having carried weight together. He nodded toward the street. "Seems different," he said. "Yeah," she replied. "It does." He smiled, that slow, steady smile that used to be rare on him. "Thanks for not giving up on people," he said. "Thanks for making space." She surprised herself by laughing. "I didn't do it alone." He shook his head. "No, you didn't. But someone had to start." They made no speeches. The rain kept time. The city went on as it always did, indifferent, immense, filled with the small, urgent noises of living. Amelia folded the unsent letters back into the drawer and placed the printed card from the anonymous man who'd slept in a bed into her wallet. It was not a ledger, it was a reminder. Later that night, alone in the soft halo of her desk lamp, she opened the notebook where she had saved the fragments of all the stories she had heard. She took up her pen and began to write. Not a directive, not a complaint, not a law. Just a sentence at first, then a second, then a paragraph. The sentences did not aim to fix the world. They aimed to remember it. A small list of what mattered, a handful of instructions a person might give another in a moment when the world felt like too much. Be present. Protect the private. Do what you can with what you have. Don't mistake motion for meaning. She folded the page and placed it into the drawer with the letters, a soft repository of small architecture. Outside, the rain softened into the hush that settles when a city leans into night. She thought of Daniel and the weight of his quiet courage, of Mateo and the bread he shared, of Jonah and the afternoons that now hummed like machinery tuned well. She thought of Lena and Thomas and the way the bureaucratic machine, once slowed by human consideration, could be remade inch by inch. There was no final moral to hang on the story, no tidy closure that would make it safe for headlines. The city didn't promise such endings. What it offered, stubbornly and without fanfare, were the opportunities for small repair. Rooms where people could practice listening, opportunities to say sorry and to accept apologies, the chance to hand a single warm loaf to someone who might otherwise go hungry. Amelia closed a drawer, turned off the lamp, and stood at the window. Rain freshened the air. The skyline and its thousand small lights blurred into a single, breathing thing. She watched the scene as if it were a map she had been asked to read. Somewhere below, a bell rang, maybe from a bakery, maybe from a bicycle. It was a small sound, then another, then the echo of feet on wet pavement. Those sounds were not enough to fix everything. But they were, she realized with a quiet ferocity, enough to keep someone from falling all the way. She leaned her forehead against the glass and let the city hum.